So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us for this month's Digging In with TPS-MTSU. So this month we are exploring the topic of labor, but as always, before we turn things over and get into our topic for the month, let's take just a couple minutes to do some housekeeping. If I can get my computer to, oh, there we go. So again, just a reminder, that you should keep your mics muted, to rename yourself, and again, to make this as interactive as possible as we go through. So again, using that chat box, reaction buttons, and we won't be doing any polling today. And of course, we have all of the resources for this month's session with Digging In available on our Padlet, which you can find here using the QR code or the link, as well as you can find all of the resources from our previous sessions in this series, as well as the link to our YouTube channel where you can find all of those past sessions as well. So again, make sure you take a look at that. There's some great stuff on there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Stacy Graham, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the theme for this month.
Thanks, Kira. I'm going to share my screen so we can take a look really quickly at this month's newsletter. And I'm going to make it larger so it's a little bit easier to see, hopefully. There. So we wanted to talk about labor again for a newsletter issue. We did a first issue on labor back in May of 2014, and that is linked from the theme box right on the first page of the current newsletter, so you can get there and all those resources very easily. And one thing about labor is that we tend to think of it in only certain parts of the curriculum where it's explicitly stated in the standards, particularly with the progressive movement and maybe the Great Depression and Industrial Revolution and things like that. But labor, of course, is an issue whenever you have people who are working, which pretty much covers all of civilized human history. So you can find worker issues in whatever it is that you are teaching. But again, the standards tend to concentrate on them in certain periods of time, which is reflected in a lot of the materials that we create on our website and also the Library of Congress. But, and you can see a lot of the stuff that we have already done in the important links box on page 2. For instance, we have lesson plans on social costs to the Industrial Revolution, the Triangle Factory Fire, child labor, growth of the slave economy. Those are all our previous lesson plans that are on our website. But we've also done a lot of labor-related lesson ideas in previous newsletters on other topics. So I just picked out a handful. This isn't even a comprehensive list. But you know, we've done a lesson idea on the Coal Creek Convict Lease Wars, a couple on child labor, which is why both of these words are hyperlinked, a couple talking about the differences between indentured servitude and chattel slavery, if you're doing the 8th grade portion of American History Survey. Even things like workplace communication, and this looks at a lot of kind of graphic arts and posters, and how that kind of factors into the workplace. Women in agriculture, early 20th century industry. So all of those will take you to different newsletter issues, and you just scroll through it till you find that particular lesson idea. So there's so many things, of course, we couldn't fit them all in here. And I'll talk more about our resources later in the webcast. But I also wanted to point out our awesome source of the month, which is a photograph of Frances Perkins while she is serving as the Secretary of Labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the New Deal period in the 1930s. And she is known for being the longest serving Secretary of Labor that we've ever had in the United States, as well as the very first female cabinet secretary ever in the United States government. And she was one of the main architects of a lot of New Deal programs, and she was very, very important because of that. And so you may have been hearing about her lately because of Labor Day and a lot of awareness raised during this month of September. But we wanted to jump on there and link to a couple things about her that you can get to from the caption here. So this is a blog article just about her that came out in the Law Librarian's blog. So you can read more about her here and what she was able to accomplish. There's also a Frances Perkins Center honoring her legacy. And of course, you can read a lot more about her here as well. A very interesting person. So I am going to go ahead and turn over to the featured lesson ideas portion of our newscast, and then I'll be back later talking a bit more about resources. So Layla.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Graham. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with y'all. Okay, here, there we go. I had it minimized. It wasn't showing it for some reason. Okay, let me pull this over and go into presenter mode. There's so many buttons you have to click. Okay, so this lesson idea is specifically about the Fraterville mine disaster in Anderson County in East Tennessee. It happened in 1902. So this essential question for this activity, and this is the lesson idea on the newsletter, and y'all can unmute yourself if you want, because we're going to be talking just very briefly. So what were mining conditions like for miners, adults, and children in Appalachia in the early 20th century? So this is something you're going to kick off the lesson with your students. Think about this question. What were mining conditions like?
So I think about this time period, and of course, this is, I would imagine, pre-OSHA. So not a lot of workplace safety, regulations involved. And then the fact that you have children working in mines. Again, I'm thinking lots of potential dangers involved for the workers.
Yeah, good. And you mentioned children. I think it's like 1905 when children are required to start going to school off and on, not even like full, everybody's in school constantly, but in the early 1900s, at least pre-1905, I think kids were not required to go to school. What else?
Well, also Appalachia is historically a lower income part of the country. And so a lot of families are pressured to try to, as many people who can work would work in the families just to supplement the family income. So a lot of the impetus behind children working would probably come from parents because they needed it. And also just a matter of, bring your kid to work day because there's no daycare and there's no school. So the family structure makes it kind of hard to avoid this. And so I kind of wonder what happened to those kids after, they weren't allowed to do that anymore. What happened to those families?
Yeah, good. So when we think about mining conditions, we said adults, children are tagging along, whether they're working or just there. We also have probably not great working conditions, right? When you see those mining pictures, we'll look at some in a minute. How do the miners look in the images?
They look like they could use a washing machine.
Yeah. Yes. They look like they could use a washing machine. Good. Anything else before I go on?
Well, you always see, especially with coal mines, they're covered in kind of that black dust. And then of course that makes you think about, what they're breathing in. So again, the health implications of the profession as well.
Yeah, good. So covered in black dust, probably not the most healthy. They look like they need to get scrubbed down. Good. Okay, so as we go through, just keep this question in mind. We'll be looking at a few images and a few documents and grouping them together, but always keep this essential question in the back of your mind as we go forward. Okay, so this lesson idea has you actually looking at two images to start with because images are usually what engage our students really quickly. And then we can bring in documents, other pieces as well to kind of continue that interest. So this image is something you show your students. you could do a quick primary source analysis. What do you see? What do you know? What questions do you have? Have them work in small groups and point out important things that stick out to them in this image. But the key part of this activity is also just bringing together the sources, one source at a time. So in this corner, and I have this bigger on a slide too, I just wanted you to see what picture I was talking about with this document here. This is our synthesizing sources document from our website. And over here you have the source. So you can put the title, or is this source number 1, whatever you want students to list it as. And then what format is this source? What makes this source primary or secondary, or even tertiary? As you're looking at it, what kind of source is this? And is it a primary or secondary source? And then what information does this source provide? And really in photographs, we can get as little or as much information as we want looking at photographs. So let's start with this one. This source is titled Young Drivers and Trapper Boy, Brown Mine, Brown, West Virginia, underground from 7 a.m. to 5:30 p.m., September 1908. And this is in Brown, West Virginia. So the pictures we're looking at today are not in Tennessee, they're in West Virginia, but similar conditions. So looking at this source, what format is this source?
So it's a photograph.
It's a photograph. And what makes this source primary or secondary? What are your thoughts there?
Well, it was taken in 1908 of kids who were that age in 1908 who were just, who actually worked at the mines. So even though it looks staged, they were definitely aware that it was being taken. It's still a primary source.
Good. And I think I wanted to ask that question because I think a lot of students have trouble differentiating between a primary and a secondary source sometimes, even though this is a photo we're looking at after the fact, it's a primary source for this time period, this event. So what information does this photo or this source provide when looking at it? What do we get just from looking at this photo?
Well, we can see the entrance to one of the mine shafts. And then we see, of course, some of the, the young boys who are workers and kind of the clothes that they wear. And then the thing that really stood out to me are the animals.
Right.
Why did the animals stick out to you? Can I ask?
So I don't think that we think about, the use of animals in mining, in mines. So, and I think that would be really surprising to students.
Right. But then it also, makes you think about, well, are they pulling, heavy wagons? So this is before a mechanized system. But you can see a bunch of wires at the top. So I wonder what those wires are conveying. Or are they cables for support? Is there any electricity involved? But you can see like the wooden structures, kind of the girders holding up the mine entrance, and even those 2 poles on the ground. I wonder if those are somehow part of this structure. So yeah, it's interesting to see all the stuff beyond just the people, who are, of course, the most interesting part.
Yeah,
I think
good. And you said, go ahead.
I think those wooden columns are called headers.
Okay.
Trying to pull back on my mining knowledge from years past.
I should have more, but unfortunately I'm rusty.
No judgment. So what I was going to say is those things on the ground, I initially thought those were like tracks, maybe to pull things in and out. But I didn't notice the one in the further corner of the picture. I just noticed that one right in the middle between the boys and the animals. But I don't know. And I said boys in this picture because to me, what stands out in this image is how young the people are. And our essential question goes back to what were mining conditions like for adults and children. And looking in this picture, I mean, I'm no expert, but how old would y'all think these kids are, or these people photographed?
I would say as young as 10 and maybe no older than 16. Definitely underage.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking as well. Like maybe late elementary to high school. That's what we're looking at right here. And they are working from 7 a.m. to 5:30. That's more information we're getting just from this caption alone. And they're young drivers and they're a trapper boy. There's a trapper boy, singular. So we could have our students look up and think, what's a young driver? what's a trapper boy, and how are those jobs different? What can we get from just this caption about job titles within a mine?
Right.
So this is our first source you could look at. And again, we've had a lot of discussion just in a few minutes about this source, but if you had students look at it in small groups, do a see no wonder, maybe you didn't give them the caption at first and just had them look into it and then provided them with a caption, some more information on the photograph, they could continue to fill out the synthesizing sources handout. And
Well,
this is the first image. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that this has a lot of labor issues that you can talk about. I mean, not only child labor, but those hours. I can't get over those hours. It's 10 and a half hours, right?
Mm-hmm.
Am I doing my math right? 10 and a half hours. And you
Right.
imagine they would do this 5 or 6 days a week. So that's way beyond the 40-hour work week. So this is not only before we have child labor laws, but we have like actual 40-hour a week laws for that as well. And then of course the safety conditions. So there's so many different things going on in here, not just the fact that they're very young.
Yeah, and you said 7 a.m. to 5:30. So in the caption, it just says underground from
Yeah.
7 a.m. to 5:30. So
They could be
they're
working beyond that.
that's what I'm thinking. Like they're getting there before that and then probably finishing up and weighing their coal, everything else at the end of the day. So that's just the time they're underground. And think about, like Kira said, safety issues. You're probably hunkered over in the mine, just not just like your lungs, your skin, everything else, but it's hard physical labor.
You have to, I mean, do they get breaks so they can eat and use the bathroom? I mean, like, that's 10 and a half hours.
Yeah, so it would
Well-
be interesting to have students maybe try to do a little research to find out, you know, with the what were the average, like how deep did some of these mines go? Like, because again, maybe it was that some of the people like they couldn't come back out because it would take so much time out of the workday that would impact productivity. So yeah, to find out again, what were the conditions like inside the mine? Again, what was the space like? Because obviously there were spaces where it was big enough to have animals. But I imagine as you know, got off into some of the coal veins, that it was probably much tighter spaces for them to work.
Yeah, or did they work in shifts? You know, was it that maybe not individuals did, but maybe like the group as a whole were underground in shifts? Now I want to know.
I know. I see. This is the rabbit hole you can go down with your students with this lesson. How did labor laws change as this continues? How did child labor laws change? How did safety laws change? How did mining change, or did it, like as we continue on over the next few years? So this is our first source that we're working with. And then the second image I have right here, it's from the same collection. I think it's the National Committee for Child Labor collection, a National Child Labor Committee collection, something along those lines. And this is titled Young Driver in Mine, had been driving 1 year, 7 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. daily. It's from the same mine, Brown, West Virginia. So let's just look at this image now, because this is more of a close-up than the other image that we had. It's a little more personal looking at it. So this, of course, is an image. We have the title there. And just like the previous source, it's a primary source. It's 1908. I assume it's 1908. It said no date, but it's from the same collection. So we're just going to assume that. So what information does this source provide? What do you see? What questions do you have? What do we already know?
Well, you can get a closer look at the clothing, which is really interesting. And not just that, but the accessories. Like what is that he's kind of has draped around his shoulders? It looks kind of like a whip. Maybe that's for the animals.
That
and
was
then
my
that thing
first
on his
thought.
head. The thing on the hat. I mean, is that something that lights the way? It looks like it might be a pre-electrical way of casting light. I don't know, but I love how even though it's a sepia tone image, you can tell that he's blue-eyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. What else?
So those are the things that stood out to me too. Again, seeing the kind of the whip around his neck. Okay, well, obviously the driver, and seeing the horses, or the probably mules actually, in the previous image. Like obviously the drivers were the ones who were, you know, escorting the animals in and out of the mines, probably pulling the wagons of coal. So that's, I would assume now that's probably what the job of the driver was.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just providing that picture first allows us to have more context for this second image. It kind of, they build upon one another. And I like that y'all pointed out the hat and the lamp, because I found one of those a couple of months ago. Like, we have one at the East Tennessee History Center, and I was like, what is this? And then you have the lamp, you hook it onto the hat. It's very dangerous. That's not something that you would think would be very safe in a mine, right? Fire, oil, that kind of thing, just
No.
hanging loosely off a hat. And like, it's not like the hard hats that we think of today. You can see it's a floppy hat that he's wearing. It doesn't have much structure to it. Not like a hard hat or a construction hat. And I like that y'all mentioned the whip around his shoulders too, because like I said, I think having the picture before allows for us to understand what that is, what the context for that as well. And again, it says he's been driving for 1 year. How old do we think this dude looks?
12.
Or 13,
Yeah.
14 years old max.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would say between 12 and 14. Yeah, so he's been driving for at least 1 year. So at the ripe old age of 14, probably.
I wonder, with these young boys, if they were getting experience working on kind of, it's probably small family farms, working with the animals, and then they were able to kind of parlay that experience into working with the animals in the mines. If that's why, again, these younger boys are being selected to do that job.
That could be, although, it's such a, yeah, such a mountainous region. Like, I don't know how many family farms were still really kind of, I guess there were still a lot of just small family farms,
Like
but
sustenance farming.
yeah, because obviously they would have had animals in, even if not farming, other aspects of their rural life, just for transportation, if nothing else. And yeah, I think that those are mules, if not donkeys. For that, one of them looked like a donkey, but so yeah, I bet that they would have been really already familiar with that, and that helps explain what driver is, because the students will not be familiar with driver in a non-car context, but now we just have to know what the other thing means, the other.
Yeah, and so trapper boy. Okay, young drivers and trapper boy. And we see these drivers up here, they all have whips.
Yeah,
the ones hanging
now
around their
I see
necks.
it. I didn't notice those before, but now it's good to go back and forth between the two photos.
Yeah, and kind of look at what we can get. And I think actually this boy right here is the boy from this image.
Could be.
So I think that's him in the same image. And on this image here, I just want to point out the caption. Not only does it say 7 a.m. to 5:30 p.m., it says daily. So we are looking at, exactly, it could be 6 days or 7 days a week looking at this. And we could, like you said, bring in all of these other issues surrounding labor reform, education reform, safety, anything like that we could bring into. So just these two photos and their captions have provided us with a lot of information to answer this question. What were mining conditions like for adults and for children in the mines of Appalachia in the early 20th century? So do y'all have questions or comments before we go on? No? Okay. So here's just that in a bigger source. I've linked this, and it's linked in the lesson idea too in our newsletter. So you can access this synthesizing sources handout. And there's room for 4 sources. So we have 2 more sources to look at right here. And these are sources that are, they're a little bit harder to find in a clearer view, but these are from newspapers.com. And I cropped out a few of the other letters. But I do want to provide y'all some context on this, some context on these letters that I'm showing you on the screen. So in 1902, there was actually something called the Fraterville mine explosion. I mentioned this at the beginning of the lesson in Anderson County, Tennessee. It happened on May 19th, 1902. It was the worst mining disaster in Tennessee history. So just a few years before these pictures were taken, these are taken in 1908. So these are post mine disasters already. So it happened on May 19th, 1902. worst mining disaster in Tennessee history. And I've read conflicting reports because I want y'all to know that as I was reading through these reports, some things say 184 men died, some things say 216, some of the reports say 226. So this kind of just lets your students know how things are reported a little bit differently as you're looking through newspaper sources, as you're looking through historian accounts, different historiography and scholarship about these events. So from what I've seen on multiple accounts, it says 216. So that's the number we're going to go with. It kind of meets in the middle there. 216 miners were killed in this mining explosion. So there were miners investigating a collapsed wall, and then sources say that there was some kind of fire that was ignited, maybe by methane gas, a pocket of methane gas that was ignited and caused an explosion. So debris and smoke blasted everywhere you can imagine. It was a very big explosion that happened. And it resulted in over 180, 90 people being killed upon impact, just from the initial explosion. But some of the miners were not killed instantly. And that's the thing. In these mining disasters, you have to remember, in these big explosions, while many people were killed on impact, others were in these, like you said, as you go in, the mines get smaller. They found some pockets, like they'd be back in the mine as they got further and further in. Some of these miners did not get killed instantly upon impact. They were in the mines for a pretty good while, and they suffocated. And the letters that I'm going to show you next for this activity were letters that the miners who survived the initial blast wrote to their family. There were 26 of them, I think. So most of the miners, like I said, were killed in the initial explosion, but at least 26 barricaded themselves into a passage, and they eventually suffocated hours later. They knew there was no hope for rescue. It wasn't like very common to be rescued after these massive explosions. So I think 5 of them, 13 miners, see, and this says 13 miners. So what the resources that I found, some say 13 miners were found, some say 26 were found. And then on this next one, it says 5 of them wrote letters. So these sources are very conflicting as you're going through. But some of them barricaded themselves in a wall and wrote these letters knowing that they wouldn't be coming back to their family. And 5 of these letters were published, these letters from 5 men were published. Let me just say that. And it's very interesting because this is another source you can bring in and show your students on that synthesizing sources handout, along with those images, how were mining conditions for adults and children. And when you look at these images, one of the ones that killed me that I don't have in this screenshot here, or in this image here, is a man who said, "To my boys, never work in a mine." So just these letters really speak to the condition as well. The letter from Jacob Val was actually housed at the East Tennessee History Center, the Museum of East Tennessee History in downtown Knoxville. We have the Jacob Val letters there. They're on the screen now. But on Jacob's letters, you can see that he's talking about Elbert. And Elbert is actually Jacob's 14-year-old son, who's trapped in the mine with him, who ends up dying before Jacob. You can see in the second letter, I point at my screen like you can see I'm talking to you. In this letter right here, he writes, "There is few of us here, but a few of us here, and I don't know where the other men are. Elbert said for you all to meet him in heaven. Tell all the children to meet with us." And then over here, Elbert tells his brother, Jacob is writing that Elbert tells his brother to, I think, take his clothes or his shoes, something along those lines. So we can see that this is a reality that children are also having to face, right? Those young boys that we just saw in the picture are much like Elbert that Jacob is describing here. So these letters are all published and available in various newspapers. This is from newspapers.com, and I linked the information in the newsletter, A Lesson Idea, so you can see the full image. But a lot of these men, I also just want to point this out quickly, a lot of these men don't have a formal education. And as you're reading this, you can kind of see how life and labor took precedent over education for these men. It was their livelihood. A lot of the words are spelled wrong or misspelled. They are resigned to the fact that they are going to die in this mine. And I also want to point out all these images are only of boys and men. all these letters are only about boys and men. So this is a male field at this point, a male dominated field where only men are being impacted by mining, but like the labor of mining, but the whole town of women, for example, Freighterville, they're missing entire generations of men after this mining explosion. And the women and the communities, the children in the communities were greatly impacted. Fathers, sons, nephews, brothers, so many people were lost in a community, all these connections. Something that I read, I think it said that like some people lost every male member of their family in this disaster from the Freighterville mine disaster. So when we look at that essential question again, how were conditions in the mine? These letters really give us a sneak peek into how the realities of mining and the dangerous realities, the devastation. And this is another source that you can pull in. This is from Chronicling America. I'm pretty sure it's from Chronicling America. It says 226 miners are dead. So there's that discrepancy again, 141 bodies found. And it talks about the loss of life, the explosion. The latest information places the numbers of dead at 184. So these numbers continue to go up. Only 70 bodies have been recovered, but they continue to recover people. Nobody is recovered alive from this explosion. So it really, again, speaks to the dangerous conditions of mining for adults and children working in the mines in Appalachia in the early 1900s. Down here, this last sentence is only 70 bodies have been recovered, but the stench in the mine and the other conditions encountered by the relief parties leave no hope that any of the workers is yet alive. So just that sentence there, and you can pull back in the synthesizing sources sheet again, because we have those images, we have some context. It's a similar time period, about 5 to 10 years difference. And we can talk about what these images, the images that we looked at first, and what these newspaper articles provide us with to really answer that investigative question again. What were mining conditions like for adults and children in Appalachia in the early 20th century? And I like this second part of the synthesizing sources handout, because you have the source that you looked at, you have your answer to the investigative question up at the top, and you can say, how does this source support your answer? So this is important. The students can pull in these specific pieces, specific parts from the images, specific parts from the newspaper articles, things like that to really support their answer. And if there is a place where it doesn't support, like maybe you're making an assumption, like that one image I saw that didn't have a date on it, how does it not support your answer and how would you account for that? So how can you pull this all together and make an educated and have an educated answer to this question? And are you guessing or are you using sources to back up your work? I think this is really important for students to use to really build those thinking skills. And then again, they would just come back and answer that investigative question or essential question throughout. Do y'all have any questions? Okay. We probably should have ended on that lesson because it wasn't a good one to kick us off with morale wise. I'm sorry. I'm gonna quit sharing my screen and turn it back over to Kira. Thanks y'all for being fun participants.
All right, well, I am going to be talking about migrant farm workers and the United Farm Workers. And in many ways, this isn't a much happier topic, unfortunately. So when I was trying to think about what I wanted to do for the newsletter for this month, I wanted to pick something that was more of a 20th century topic, and especially one that would kind of get into the second half of the 20th century. But going into it, I also was like, yeah, you know, at the Library of Congress, you never quite know what you're going to find source-wise when you get into those late 20th century topics. And I was pretty pleasantly surprised that I found some really good stuff, but again, in some of those not so obvious places. And so what I want to focus on, I'm going to walk you through some of the ideas that I had for how to use the sources, but more I want to show you again what I found that again, maybe will give you an idea of, again, some of those not so obvious places to look for sources. So when you kind of cross topics that, again, you know, the library doesn't have as many collections that are clear cut for, you can always, again, find these workarounds. So one of the first things to kind of keep in mind, that I think with students is, when we think about migrant farm workers and especially United Farm Workers Union, a lot of that is really West Coast California based history. And so students may not realize the importance of agriculture in the California economy. I think a lot of times we think about agriculture, we think about the South, we think about maybe the Midwest, but I don't think we always think about California. And so I found this list of really kind of the top agricultural products that are actually still being produced in California that really kind of drive the agriculture economy there. And again, I think some of them are pretty obvious when we think about grapes, which of course we think about the wine country in California, so that's pretty obvious. We might even think about like almonds or some of the citrus, but maybe we don't think about dairy being a key product, or we don't think about cattle, or broccoli or hay, or any of these other things that are really very important to their agricultural economy. And that's really that part of the economy has always been very vital to the larger state economy there. But when we think about the 20th century, we also need to think about the fact that much of the agribusiness is not being done by small family farms. It is more kind of large agricultural businesses. And so then we need to think about, well, who are the workers that are working for these large agricultural businesses? Again, if it's not small family farms. And the answer to that is largely it's a lot of minority communities. So you have African Americans who work there. You have a lot of either Mexican Americans or people of Mexican heritage who are U.S. citizens. You have people who are of Asian descent. And then you have a lot of just immigrant communities, either those who are coming up from Latin America or again, people who have come over from Asia, as well as Native American communities that are there working in the fields in the agricultural business. The other thing to keep in mind is that depending on how the agribusiness is going, are prices for crops up or are they down, really impacts how they are going about recruiting that labor. So when prices are high, we are they are trying to recruit more sources of labor, especially cheap labor, and so you have policies that would be encouraging Mexican migrant farm workers to come up to work in California and places in the Southwest, and then when prices aren't as good, you have policies that would then discourage those workers. So when we think about, maybe how to get into some of this, you might want to start with thinking about, what was life like for migrant farm workers during the Great Depression? And of course, the Library of Congress has some really great photographic collections that really kind of encapsulate that. And really is a good juxtaposition to also thinking about what the conditions were like for people who were migrants because of the Dust Bowl, who were coming across from Oklahoma or Arkansas in that area. So the two images that we have here are from Mexican farm workers, and it's actually their living conditions in the Imperial Valley in California in 1937. And before we talk about these a lot, I want to also mention that it's really, I think interesting to note for students that, as I was mentioning, the kind of the changes in immigration policy. Of course, with agriculture, the Great Depression hit much earlier than it did for other sectors of the economy. So really in the 1920s, late 20s, it was, prices were down and things weren't great for agriculture. So we see a change in the U.S. immigration policies where they are actually actively deporting Mexican farm workers, and even within those roundups, they captured some people who were U.S. citizens of Mexican heritage, and they were also sent back to Mexico. And so you have this kind of real stringent immigration policy that's taking place during this time period. So when we look at these two images, what are some things that really kind of strike you about the living conditions for these farm workers?
They're terrible.
Yeah, they're horrific, right? I mean, it looks like the one there on the left. And what do you think those materials are made out of?
Whatever they had at hand. It doesn't even look like standardized construction materials like wood. It's whatever they could get their hands on and slap on.
It makes me think of the Great Depression. Think about like Hoovervilles or Shantytown, that kind of thing is what it makes me think of.
I mean, that looks, I mean, it looks like dirt walls and like thatch roofs, like
Mhm.
we're, you know, from thousands of years ago or something.
Yeah, so there's pretty like stark that just the horrific conditions that these workers are living in. And the thing that really kind of struck me about the image on the left is that the man is holding a small child. And so that it's not just, you know, the workers who are in the field, but it's their families who are also living in these conditions.
I just
So,
want to, hey, Kira, the car also gives you some perspective. The guy on the image on the left, he's leaning up against the car.
mhm.
And that front part of the car is almost as big as the entire house to the left.
Yeah. Yeah, the scale, we were using the car and also him, like, you know, he's kind of leaned over, but it still looks like
Taller
that.
than the house.
Yeah, he's almost as tall as the house. So, you know, it's not like, you know, it was 7-foot ceilings here. It's probably just tall enough for him to stand up in. So this kind of gives students a sense of, again, the conditions for farm workers, again, in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And of course, you know, they weren't great for either those who were, you know, Mexican farm workers, as well as, again, the people who, you know, the Okies and stuff who were coming over. Because, again, we think about the migrant mother image also kind of falls into the same category of these migrant farm workers. But as we get into the 1940s with World War II, the United States government works out a deal with Mexico to start a program called the Braceria program. And this program basically is a guest worker program to entice migrant farm workers, as well as some other industries as well, but mainly farm workers, agricultural workers, to come up to the US to address labor shortages. One thing that's really interesting is that this program starts almost immediately after the Japanese internment camps are opened. So I'm sure it's not the only reason there were labor shortages, but I think it's very interesting that the two coincide with each other. So one of the things, again, this may not be something that your students are real familiar with, but the Library of Congress has a really great resource, this research guide here, that can give you some good information about the Braceria program to help kind of fill in some gaps for your students. And so you get a nice little summary of it. Again, a timeline here that kind of gives you, outlines the program. And we also, of course, see that it doesn't end until 1964. And I'll talk about that again in a little bit in just a moment. The other thing that this page has that I think is real helpful are these resource links. And so some things that might be, again, of interest to you, there's a really interesting post here in one of the blogs about how this fits into the larger you know, efforts that were happening between the United States government and different Latin American countries during the good neighbor policies during World War II and their efforts to support the Allied powers. You have some information here about immigration and relocation in US history. And this page has a really interesting section with some information about, again, depressions and the struggle for survival during that previous period before the Braceria program starts. So that's got some nice background information that would be helpful for your students. If I can get back to my... Well, okay. And then you also have some images here. And I want to take a moment to look at these images. So you can get to these this way, and I'm going to pull them up as a slideshow. And again, these are images of some of the workers who were part of the Braceria program. And I want to think, as we look through this, I want you to think about these images in juxtaposition to the ones that we just looked at. And so again, think about the tone, you know, what are the feel that you get from these images?
Well, for one thing, they look well fed. You saw a lot of food there. Now they're all smiling and looking like they're playing around with each other. So I wonder, did the photographer catch them at the right moment, or did the photographer say, smile, we want this to reflect well on the program?
All of the images are outside except for that first one you showed us. Everything is out in a field or outside. It looks kind of hot. doesn't look like easy labor. A lot of pictures have them like this one, they're bending over.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like it'd be very comfortable after doing it for a few minutes.
No, but it looks like they at least have decent clothes.
Mhm. Yeah,
They keep holding their hands up in some sort of symbol. I guess it's a good one. I don't know. Yeah, they keep doing this
yeah.
backward peace sign, or this forwards peace sign. So I'm wondering what that means.
And I think this one really stood out to me because you see women in this one, but yet in all of the others we see, because it's just men in the field. So I would love to know a little bit more about, were there women involved in the program as well?
We've seen an American flag in a lot of pictures. I wonder, that makes me think some of this might be staged as well, because there's an American flag like strategically placed in someone's hand or in the background in a few of these images.
I wonder how many sugar beets it takes to fill up that truck.
Mhm.
That's a lot. But it looks like they all have some sort of ribbon or tag in certain pictures. So I'm like wondering, do they have to wear those? Does it have their name on it, or is that like a festive thing? And what is this peace sign thing? Oh, those people look really happy. That guy's just chilling.
Yep.
But yeah, this looks like a much better existence than the one that you can imagine taking place in those shacks. But then we can't see like their houses here.
Right. The
Maybe
one thing
they're
that we
in like dormitories and stuff.
Yeah, the one thing that we don't see in any of those images were the living conditions, which I think is interesting. But definitely the feel of those images is much more positive. That these workers are very happy to have these jobs. They're very happy to be there. You guys mentioned the American flag was in a couple of the images. There was also a Mexican flag in the background. So again, it was kind of like cooperation. So again, a very different feel than the previous images. Again, you just feel like maybe these folks are have better working conditions, better living conditions than the migrant workers from the 1930s. Now, of course, those were likely staged photographs to some extent to promote the program. So that, we would want to think about that when we're thinking about what they tell us. The other thing that you might could dig into some more is here on that research guide, there are some links for some overview websites. So they kind of give you more of a history into the background of the Basirio program. So that maybe you can kind of do a little more digging into that background. Now, as I mentioned, the program runs into the mid-1960s. Now, one of the things, once we get past the labor shortages of the war years, is there was a lot of critiques and criticisms of these programs by other farm workers who, again, were U.S. citizens. And that was that the program was used to drive down wages and to also thwart any efforts to unionize. And so Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who were some of the early founders of the United Farm Workers, were really critical of the Basirio program. And one of the first, considered efforts of the, within the successes of the 60s to try to organize farm workers was to try to end that program. Because basically Bracerios could serve as a, perpetual source of scab workers to stop any unionizing efforts. And so, like with the other one, there is a great research guide that the library has about the United Farm Workers Union, again, to give you a bit of a background and also a timeline. And it's interesting, you'll note here on this timeline that it mentions that when the Basirio program ends, that the Great Boycott begins later that year. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think, again, being able to end that program really did help efforts to try to organize and strike for better working conditions. And so this also takes it up, of course, into Cesar Chavez's death when his son-in-law takes over the UFW in '93. And again, like the other one, there you see there's a lot of great links here for other resources that the library has, several different pieces on Cesar Chavez. There is a really good Teaching with the Library of Congress blog article here that you can look at for other ideas. There's a really good primary source set also on Mexican American migrations and communities, again, to get back into that like context of these communities who were farm workers in California and in the Southwest. And then some pieces on Dolores Huerta as well. The other really cool thing that I found on here is this website right here, the United Farm Workers History and Geography. And this is a website that the University of Washington has put together. And you'll see that they have actually mapped where the UFW strikes and boycotts were from 65 to 75 and created a timeline. And one thing, of course, that jumped out to me is that there is a blue dot in Tennessee. And what this is, as my computer loads it here, you can hover over these dots and you'll see here that essentially, there's a boycott. 5 major chains in Atlanta removed California grapes from their shelves, and several groups throughout the city worked with UFW organizers to build pressure against the grocery store owners. Atlanta joins Miami, New Orleans, Nashville, and Louisville as an active location of the boycott. So Nashville was one of the places where you did see that boycott of the California grapes really kind of be able to get some support. So again, this website I think is pretty cool, and again can kind of give students an idea of the scope of the UFW efforts again between 65 and 75. The other thing that I think would be really good to have students discuss is this quote here. And you see this is from the preamble from the United Farm Workers Association Constitution. And this reads, "We, the farm workers of America, have tilled the soil and sown the seeds and harvested the crops. We have provided food in abundance for the people in the cities and the nation of the world, and have not had sufficient food to feed our own children." And that's a really stark statement, to think that the people who are really responsible for the food in our grocery stores were hungry and could not feed their own families. And even though the UFW, has some successes in addressing some of the working conditions for their members, this isn't an issue that ends in the 1960s. And one of the other sources I found was this kind of visual report that was put together by the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. It's kind of a long piece. It's about 80 pages. It's mostly photographs though. So I think this is something where you could pull out some different excerpts and use with your students. And you'll see, like for example, on this page here, there are little short text pieces, again, that kind of give you some additional information. And so it talks in here about, how most of these migrant farm workers were living in abject poverty. It talks about their wages and how they live below the poverty line, even though like how much that they were working. It talks about the conditions and how it impacts their kids with their education and their health outcomes. And it talks about child labor and the fact that, this is done in the late 70s and that, agricultural work is one of the few places that we still see a lot of child labor, and especially with, our poor migrant workers, that their families depended on those kids, to help make money to support the families. And again, what that did to the long-term outcomes of those kids. And so I think this is something where you could have students look at pieces of it and really think about, like, again, when we think about continuity and change, how this compares to those images that we started out with in the Great Depression. And so I think there are different pieces that you could pull out from this lesson idea, if you wanted to just focus on, the agricultural work during the Great Depression, or if you just wanted to focus on the work of the UFW during the Civil Rights era, or if you just wanted to focus on the Braceria program during World War II. Or if you want to talk about economics and contemporary issues and really kind of think about what is the current plight of migrant farm workers today, you could tie all this in together. So hopefully, these sources and this idea kind of gives you guys some different, kind of kernels to work with, because again, I think there's a lot that you could do with some of these sources. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Stacy to talk about some of the other resources that we found for the newsletter this month.
Thanks, Kira. Yeah, I'm just going to take a couple minutes and walk y'all through some of the other stuff that we have. So here we are back to the newsletter issue. And you can see this is what Kira was just telling us about right here. And I wanted to point out that October did a lesson idea on the Seattle General Strike of 1919. So this would be a great thing to cover if you're doing the progressive movement. And also so your students can learn what a general strike means, which is not specific to one particular industry, but all the industries, like a lot of labor unions in different industries and trades coming together and planning one big event. So the very first one in American history happened in Seattle in 1919. And so this one comes with, there's a little documentary, it comes with a student packet, much like some of the other ones, so that you can use this in the primary sources with your students. We also have for you 7th grade teachers out there, a lesson idea that touches on medieval feudal Europe. And believe it or not, there's a medieval document in the Library of Congress collections that is focused on. So if you just click on abbreviated translation, you'll get to the worksheet so that students can see the document, but just read a short transcription in English and talk about some of the relations between different laboring classes and non-laboring classes in that. And on page 4, have a cotton gin, and that's a preview because we're going to talk more about that when we talk about the first industrial revolution in our next issue. Women in the Great War, talking about World War I in France and what women's roles were in terms of labor. The Haymarket Riot, a very important event in American labor history. This is based on a blog article that shows the difference between 2 different advertisements for people to come to, a mass meeting. I'll give you a hint. The difference is this one on the right says, "Working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force." And the one that actually made it into circulation does not say that. So you can talk about, whoa, how different does it set a tone there when you include a statement like that? So that's a neat little juxtaposition. And then of course, Labor Day, the reason why we talk about labor in September most years, there's a blog article or a Today in History article about the first Labor Day and how it got to be a holiday in America and why we celebrate it. And so I am going to just leave it at that for right now because we have one more resource we want to share with you. And so Layla is going to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you for turning it back over, Dr. Graham. Let me share my screen again. Okay, so this is something that we're kind of testing out with our Facebook page. So if this is something you're interested in, let us know so we can continue to do this. It takes a minute to load with all the graphics. But each month when we do a newsletter, we all talk about podcasts that we've listened to, things like that. So we've decided to pull it together, podcast recommendations that relate directly to our newsletter theme. This month again is labor. So the first podcast recommendation that we have is The Battle of Blair Mountain, and it's from stuff you missed in history class. This podcast is about 40 minutes long. The podcasts range from like 5 minutes to 40 minutes, just kind of depending on what you're looking for. And each week we're going to feature different podcasts that kind of, so like we had one on coal mining, and then the one we featured for this week was the Bracera program. So we will have 2 other podcast recommendations that focus on the other 2 lesson ideas. And then the final week of September, we will do stuff on our page 4. So each week we're putting together, sorry, my little black bars in the way, let me move that down. Putting together sources like this, and all of these things are hyperlinked. We're posting the screenshot of this or the JPEG on our Facebook page. And then the link to all of this information is hyperlinked on our Facebook page as well in the post. So right here, if you click on this, when it's in a PDF or a JPEG, you will see that it'll take you to the episode. Here's the stuff you missed in history class episode on the Battle of Blair Mountain. I've also linked some images here directly from the Library of Congress, from newspapers, from Chronicling America. And then right here, I didn't realize it, but there's a topics in Chronicling America for the Battle of Blair Mountain. So very interesting. So all of that stuff is linked there. Here's the Battle of Blair Mountain topics in Chronicling America research guide. It has a timeline, has a bunch of information. So these are just little, really one-pagers that we can give you to push out even more resources and make it more accessible in case you aren't a visual learner, maybe you're an auditory learner, things like that. We also have the images from the newspapers linked. Here's that image right there from the Battle of Blair Mountain podcast recommendation. And then over here, we also have right here a few pieces from the other image over here, Miners Battle Guards. So I've hyperlinked all of this information. If you're looking at it, if there's a little arrow there, that means you should click it because it'll take you to something else. The other podcast we have recommended, this was just from yesterday. I posted this yesterday on Wednesday. And this is about the Bracero program. Sorry, I have a visitor. And I have the podcast linked right here. You click on it and it'll take you exactly to the episode. So what I did realize, if you're looking at these on your phone, it doesn't work. It'll take you to, it does work, but it'll take you to like Apple Play or Spotify. If you click on the actual JPEG on your computer desktop, it'll take you to the correct podcast link. So if that's an issue, go back and look at it on your computer and not on your phone. It's just the way phone apps are set up these days. So this week's podcast is on the front burner, and it's by the Sonoma County Office of Education. And I tried to pick one that was more geared towards teachers this week, rather than just one that was for all readers or all listeners. This one talks about the Bracero program, and specifically the Bracero History Archive that Kira kind of showed us some images from earlier. So in this second podcast recommendation, I have linked the Bracero History Archive right there. You have the podcast link. You have our newsletter linked right here. You also have the title of the podcast and the podcast episode name in case you're having trouble finding it through that hyperlink if it's not working for you for some reason. And then I also have linked here, just each week we would have a little blurb about this topic and how it relates to our newsletter or what this topic is about. So I linked to that resource guide that Kira just showed us as well in this podcast recommendation piece. And then the image will also be hyperlinked there. You can just click on that and it'll take you straight to the image right here. And I think it's funny because it said agricultural labor topping sugar beets. And you asked that question about sugar beets, Dr. Graham. So I thought that was funny. But these are all going to come out every Wednesday. Check the Facebook page, our TPS Facebook page every Wednesday afternoon. These will be posted. And if you have podcast recommendations you would like us to listen to or something that relates to our newsletter topic, please let us know, because we're always looking for recommendations to listen and to make new resources. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over.
All right, so with that, let's get ready to wrap up. So again, keep in mind we're going to have the pieces that Layla just showed us, as well as our other resources from this month on the Padlet page. So be sure to go back and check that. And then if you are interested in getting PD credit for watching this webinar, be sure to fill out our short survey here. And we check these about once a week, and then we'll go back in and create our certificates and send those out to you. So be sure to complete that. And again, you can do that for any of our past episodes as well. And next month, we'll be focusing on the first Industrial Revolution. And again, that'll be on the second Thursday of the month. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. So again, thank you guys so much for your time today, and we hope to see you again soon.